I walked into that committee room knowing exactly what they had in mind. A civilized exchange about rewilding. The atmosphere felt staged, prearranged, like a play where everyone already knew their lines. Steve Barclay sat opposite me, flanked by advisors and stacked briefing documents, radiating quiet confidence. They'd called me, Jeremy Clarkson, as though I were just another voice to hear out, another celebrity witness to nod politely and leave without causing trouble. But I hadn't come to smile and nod. I came because farmers across this country are being handed money to quit farming. And I was going to ask the one question nobody in that room was prepared to answer. Steve Barclay opened exactly as I'd anticipated. Measured, composed, armed with statistics carefully chosen to sound reasonable. He described the government's rewilding initiative as though it were beyond criticism. Farmers, he explained, could pocket up to £700 per hectare annually to remove land from production and surrender it back to nature. Woodlands, wetlands, wildflower meadows. He announced early participation figures with visible pride. More than 50,000 hectares already enrolled across England. Carbon capture, flood mitigation, biodiversity gains, public recreation. A solution with no losers, he insisted. I sat there listening, hands flat, expression even, because beneath the polished vocabulary, the underlying reality was nakedly straightforward. We were discussing paying farmers not to improve, not to adapt, but to simply stop. And as he wrapped up, clearly satisfied with his performance, I noticed something that genuinely alarmed me. This entire room was debating land management, but the word food hadn't crossed a single lip. If you think that omission matters, keep watching, because what comes next changes the entire conversation. But before I get to what happened inside that room, let me tell you about a conversation I had 3 weeks earlier. I was up at my farm in the Cotswolds, and my farm manager Dave pulled me aside. Dave's been working that land for over 20 years. His father worked it before him. He handed me a letter he'd received from a government liaison officer. It was an invitation to enroll in the rewilding scheme. Politely worded, professionally formatted, and at the bottom, a payment schedule that made it look almost generous. Dave looked at me and said something I haven't been able to shake since. He said, "Jeremy, if I take this money, I'm not just stopping farming. I'm ending something that took 3 generations to build. And once it's gone, it's gone." That was the moment I understood this wasn't a policy debate about land use. It was a quiet dismantling, and the people making the decisions had never once spoken to someone like Dave. So I went to that committee room, carrying his words with me. When Steve Barclay finished, that familiar Westminster stillness settled over the chamber, the kind that implies everything just said was unquestionably sensible. I leaned forward slightly and put the most basic question I could formulate to him. When farmers stop growing food, what exactly are people supposed to eat? You could sense the shift immediately. He smiled, though the edges pulled tight. He launched into talk of diversification, sustainability, international supply chains. I cut him off. That isn't what I asked, because his own department's figures told a completely different story. Britain already imports somewhere around 45% of its food, and under full rewilding rollout, projections indicate domestic production capacity could shrink by a further 15 to 20%. That isn't environmental balance. That's manufactured dependency. He pivoted toward efficiency, the idea of producing more from less land. I read it back to him slowly so the room could hear exactly how hollow it sounded. We reduce the farming area and somehow expect farmers to produce more. A murmur rippled through the chamber, quiet at first, because once you pull the language away, the reality becomes inescapable. We weren't debating nature restoration. We were debating how a country that already struggles to feed itself plans to grow even less of its own food. So I followed that logic straight to where it leads. If the government genuinely intended to produce more food from less land, then the tools farmers depend on should at minimum be holding steady. They're not. They're contracting at precisely the same pace as the acreage. I reminded Steve Barclay and everyone present that farmers are now operating beneath tightening fertilizer restrictions, pesticide prohibitions, and expanding water usage controls. Regulations stacked upon regulation, each one quietly trimming productivity a fraction further, and none of these introduced in consultation with the people they affect most. I've spoken to arable farmers in Lincolnshire who've watched their permitted pesticide list shrink by nearly a third in 5 years. Livestock farmers in Devon who've had water abstraction licenses reviewed and reduced without notice. These aren't theoretical constraints. They're happening right now, on working farms, to real people trying to do their jobs. So let me be clear about what's actually happening here. You're withdrawing land from food production through rewilding, while simultaneously cutting off the very inputs that make high yields achievable. Less land, fewer resources, tighter rules, and yet somehow, the expectation is greater efficiency. I delivered that equation slowly, because sometimes you have to say a thing aloud before its absurdity becomes undeniable. Cut the land, cut the chemicals, cut the water, then demand productivity miracles from the very people you've just handicapped. A labor member suggested that environmental protection necessarily involves trade-offs. I agreed entirely, but I asked who exactly was being asked to make them. Farmers surrendering businesses their grandparents built, rural communities watching the last employer in the valley disappear, or the policymakers sitting in Westminster who would still find fully loaded supermarket shelves waiting for them regardless of what was decided here today. That was the moment the room stopped agreeing and started squirming. Then I moved to the numbers, because political language obscures a great deal, but figures are considerably harder to dress up. Steve Barclay kept returning to that same headline payment, £700 per hectare for farmers entering the rewilding scheme. It sounds reasonable until you place it alongside what productive farmland actually generates. Quality agricultural land delivers somewhere between £2,000 and £3,000 per hectare in real economic output. Some of the best land in East Anglia produces more. So let's be honest about what this is. This isn't a support payment. It's a pay reduction with environmental branding attached. A financial sedative designed to make exit feel like opportunity. I put it to him directly. You're not backing farmers. You're compensating them to walk away, paying them to shrink, to produce less, to quietly disappear from the national food system, and doing it at a rate that doesn't even come close to replacing what they'd actually earn from farming well. I then raised figures from the National Farmers Union. Under full rewilding implementation, they project roughly 40,000 agricultural jobs could be eliminated. 40,000. That isn't a modeling assumption or a worst-case scenario designed to alarm people. That's a central projection from the organization that represents the sector being asked to bear the cost. I asked him what the transition plan looked like for those workers. He reached for familiar phrases: adjustment timelines, economic transition support, language engineered to cushion impact without actually describing one. But strip those words down and they mean one thing: unemployment. The managed, politely described, government-approved kind, but unemployment all the same. And the damage doesn't stay behind farm gates. That's what people sitting in London committee rooms consistently fail to grasp. When farming income collapses, the ripple moves fast. The agricultural merchant in the market town closes because his customers have gone. The rural pub loses its Friday lunchtime trade. The primary school drops below viable numbers because young families have no reason to stay. The GP surgery reduces its hours because the patient list has shrunk. The whole ecosystem that built itself around farming over centuries starts to unwind, and it does so quietly, without headlines, one closed door at a time. I've driven through villages in the Welsh borders, where that process is already well underway. Boarded-up shops, emptied community halls, farms parceled off and sold to land investment funds that have no interest in food production whatsoever. Places that were living communities 20 years ago now feel like managed decline, dressed up as countryside. You're not simply changing how land is classified. You're dismantling rural Britain piece by piece and presenting it as a positive outcome. And this is where the argument had to broaden, because if Britain produces less, the deficit doesn't simply disappear. We import the shortfall. That's always how it works. So I put a direct question to Steve Barclay. Where does he imagine that food actually comes from? Cut British beef production, and we import Brazilian beef. Grow less grain, and it arrives from Ukraine or Argentina. That's elementary trade logic. Nothing complicated about it. So I asked whether those countries operate to cleaner production standards than our own. Fewer synthetic inputs, tighter pesticide controls, stronger animal welfare protections. They don't. In most cases, they apply heavier chemical loads, operate under considerably looser oversight, and critically, they clear significantly more forest to create the farmland that ends up supplying markets like ours. The Amazon doesn't disappear because Brazil wants to feed itself. It disappears because wealthy countries decide to stop growing their own food and needs someone else to fill the gap. So when Britain takes productive land offline in the name of rewilding, we're not containing environmental harm. We're relocating it, shifting the destruction somewhere with fewer journalists and weaker environmental laws than congratulating ourselves on our domestic carbon statistics. I said it without ambiguity. You're not resolving the problem, you're offshoring it. He responded by saying the policy was designed to address domestic environmental outcomes. And that single word, domestic, revealed everything. Because carbon released in the Brazilian Cerrado still enters the same atmosphere ours does. Habitat destroyed in Argentina still reduces the same global biodiversity. You cannot declare environmental victory at home while actively accelerating destruction on the other side of the world. The planet doesn't care about your accounting categories. I laid it out plainly. You convert British farmland into wildflower meadows, then fill the caloric gap with food grown on cleared wilderness overseas. And you call that leadership. I call it creative bookkeeping. Because genuine environmental responsibility requires measuring total global impact, not just what shows up in domestic statistics. And by that honest standard, reducing efficient British farming simply transfers production to regions that frequently cause considerably more damage per unit of output. The room had gone quiet again. Not because the argument was intricate, it wasn't, but because it was disarmingly simple and very difficult to answer without admitting the policy had never seriously grappled with its own international consequences. And that's when I took the argument to its most uncomfortable destination. Because until that point we'd been discussing subsidies, carbon accounting, global supply chains. Significant matters, certainly, but still somewhat abstract to people who've never worried about where their next meal comes from. So I reduced it to something immediate and irreducible: survival. Britain currently produces roughly 60% of the food it consumes. Imperfect, but functionally stable. Under the trajectory implied by large-scale rewilding combined with the regulatory constraints I'd already described, that figure could realistically slide toward 40% within a generation. Which means we'd become approximately 60% dependent on food produced somewhere else, by someone else, under conditions we have no control over. Now, think about the last 5 years. A pandemic that exposed exactly how fragile global supply chains are. A war in Ukraine, one of the world's largest grain exporters, that sent commodity prices spiraling and supermarket shelves thinning in countries that thought food security was someone else's problem. A series of extreme weather events disrupting harvests across multiple continents simultaneously. Energy price shocks that made fertilizer so expensive that farmers across Europe reconsidered what they could afford to plant. None of that was predicted. All of it happened, and we came through it with a degree of domestic production that, while imperfect, gave us some buffer, some margin, some capacity to absorb shock. Now ask yourself what happens when the next crisis arrives, and we've voluntarily dismantled that buffer in exchange for wildflower meadows and a carbon accounting win. I put the question to Steve Barclay directly. What happens during a genuine food shortage? What happens when exporting nations decide, as they always eventually do, that their own populations come first and the shipments stop leaving their ports? What happens when a government that has paid its farmers to leave the land turns around and needs them back? Because here's what no one in that room wanted to acknowledge. You can't rebuild a farming sector in an emergency. The knowledge doesn't come back overnight. The equipment rusts. The supply chains dissolve. The people who knew how to do it have retired or retrained or left the country. A generation of agricultural capability, once broken, takes a generation to rebuild, if it comes back at all. He reached again for sustainability language, circular economy, resilient food systems. But these are phrases, not plans. Slogans don't restock empty shelves. I pressed once more. This isn't a strategy. This is optimism. Hoping global markets never seize up. Hoping geopolitical tensions never sever supply routes. Hoping Britain can permanently purchase what it has chosen not to grow. That isn't resilience. That's dependency, rebranded as environmental virtue. And the people who will pay the price for it won't be the ministers who designed the policy. They'll be the families standing in front of empty shelves, wondering how it got this far. I pointed out that food security is treated as core strategic infrastructure by virtually every serious developed nation. France protects its agricultural sector with an intensity that sometimes borders on the irrational, and they do it because they understand what food independence actually means. Germany maintains domestic production capacity. Japan, an island nation with limited arable land, treats food self-sufficiency as a matter of national security and invests accordingly. Even major trading blocs with enormous market power recognize that farming is ultimately a question of sovereignty, not just economics. But Britain? We're compensating farmers to exit the system and presenting it as forward-thinking environmental policy. We're the only country in the developed world actively paying our food producers to stop. Then I made it personal, because policy hypocrisy is sometimes sharpest when you examine it at human scale. I asked Barclay about his own garden. Maintained, I assumed. Managed, tended, productive in its own way. Perhaps with professional help to keep it looking presentable. And yet his policy proposes to let vast stretches of working farmland, land that has been cultivated and managed for centuries, revert to unmanaged wilderness, while the people who tended it are handed a check and shown the door. There's a particular kind of person who champions rewilding from a well-maintained townhouse with a subscribed organic vegetable box delivered to the door, who talks about returning land to nature while their own relationship with nature extends as far as a weekend walk and a David Attenborough documentary, who is entirely insulated from the consequences of the policy they're advocating because their food will always appear, on time, packaged and labeled, regardless of what happens to British farming. I said plainly what the room had been carefully avoiding. You want cultivated, managed green space for yourself and rewarded abandonment for everyone else. You want the aesthetic of nature without any of the responsibility for feeding the country that depends on that land. That isn't environmentalism. That's class privilege with a conservation label. And the people paying the real price are the ones who never got invited to design the policy in the first place. By then, the committee had fractured into open argument. MPs speaking across each other, aides whispering urgently into phones, cameras shifting as though they sensed something had genuinely cracked open. The chair was attempting to restore order with the weary expression of someone who knows they've already lost control of the room. And through all of it, Steve Barclay stood visibly unsettled. The earlier composure had been replaced by careful hedging, tightened expressions, and the particular look of someone searching for an answer they don't actually have. I stayed in my seat, calm, because the point had already done its work. And I've learned over the years that the person who stays still when the room erupts is usually the one people remember. What happened next is the part that rarely makes the edited highlights. In the corridor outside, after the session formally dissolved, two MPs approached me separately. Neither from my side of any political argument. One had grown up on a farm in Cumbria, the other represented a constituency in Norfolk, where agriculture is the primary employer. Both said, quietly and without cameras present, that they agreed with the central argument, but couldn't say so publicly because the party position was fixed. One of them used a phrase I found genuinely chilling. He said the decision had already been made at a level above committee. What we were doing in that room was process, not deliberation. That corridor conversation told me more about how this policy was constructed than anything said during the session itself. It wasn't built from evidence or consultation. It was built from ideology, dressed in environmental language, and presented to farmers as a fait accompli. Outside the building, a small group of farmers had gathered. Not a protest, no banners, no noise. Just a group of people in work clothes, standing on a pavement, watching the entrance. Some of them had driven hours to be there. Not because they expected anything to change that day, but because they wanted someone inside to know they existed, that they were watching, that they hadn't simply accepted what was being decided about their futures in rooms they weren't invited into. I stopped and spoke to them for 20 minutes, and the stories were consistent across different farms, different counties, different types of agriculture. The letter arriving, the payment offer, the underlying message, we'd rather you weren't here. One woman, dairy farmer, third generation, told me she'd received the Rewilding invitation the same week her bank had reduced her operating credit line. She said it felt less like an opportunity and more like a trap. Take the money or struggle on with less support than you had last year. Those were the real choices on offer. That is not a voluntary scheme. That is managed exit dressed up as choice. I stood back in front of the cameras after, and I made one final point clear enough that it couldn't be quietly buried in committee paperwork or softened in subsequent press releases. Farming isn't a line on a spreadsheet you can reduce at will. It isn't a sector that can be paused and restarted like a subscription service. It's a functioning structure that holds rural Britain together in ways that don't appear on any balance sheet. Dismantle it, And the effects travel far, and they travel fast. Communities thin out. Schools lose the numbers needed to stay open. Local businesses lose the customers who kept them viable through quiet seasons. Generations of accumulated practical knowledge, the kind that tells you what this specific field does in a wet spring, what this particular breed needs in a hard winter. Knowledge that took lifetimes to accumulate and cannot be found in any government database begins to disappear. And once that foundation crumbles, you don't rebuild it with a policy reversal and a press release. You don't get it back at all. I told the room they were approaching this from entirely the wrong direction. If genuine environmental improvement is the goal, and I don't doubt that for many people it sincerely is, then the answer is to invest in farmers to farm more intelligently. Not to stop altogether. Back soil regeneration practices that actually improve long-term productivity. Support water efficiency technology. Encourage precision agriculture that reduces input waste. Facilitate proper habitat integration within working farms, rather than instead of them. Engage the people who already understand this land, rather than subsidizing their departure from it. Because the farmers I know are not the enemy of the environment. They are its most consistent long-term stewards. They live on that land. Their children play on it. They watch what happens to it across decades. No rewilding scheme designed in Westminster will ever care for a piece of ground the way the family that has farmed it for 4 generations does. When you pay producers to leave, you don't just reduce output. You sever the relationship between people and land that has underpinned rural Britain for centuries. You erode resilience, discard irreplaceable knowledge, and permanently weaken a national capability that you will one day desperately wish you had preserved. The chair called for order one final time. It was largely ignored. MPs filed out still arguing. Journalists moved through the corridors pursuing reactions. Someone from a national paper caught me at the door and asked what I thought the minister's response had been. I told them to watch the footage and count how many times he'd answered the central question. The answer was 0. Outside, the farmers were still there. I nodded at them as I passed. The dairy farmer from earlier caught my eye. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. The real story that day wasn't the confrontation, wasn't the headlines, wasn't any of the theater that television loves to package and replay. The real story was the question that remained unanswered when the session ended. The one that no policy document, no briefing paper, no set of environmental projections had seriously addressed. If a nation methodically sidelines its own farmers, dismantles the infrastructure that surrounds them, and replaces domestic production with imported food from countries with lower standards and higher environmental costs, what precisely is its plan for feeding itself when the world stops cooperating? Not if, when. Because the world has a habit of becoming uncooperative, and countries that can feed themselves when it does are the ones that survive intact. The ones that can't are the ones that spend those moments wishing they'd made different decisions when they still had the chance. We still have the chance. Just about. If this concerns you, not just as an environmental question, but as a question of food, of community, of what kind of country we want to be capable of being when it matters most, then stay engaged. Challenge the language when it sounds too smooth. Question the assumptions when they go unexamined. Ask who pays the price when the projections turn out to be wrong. And if you want these realities examined without the political gloss, without the committee room theater, without the carefully managed messaging designed to make managed decline feel like progress, make sure you're following along. Because this conversation has barely started, and the decisions being made right now will be lived with for a very long time.